who needs checking, and what you should be recording. Now, this is just an introductory look. We'll take about an hour and a half or so, so that there are some aspects and some of the bigger complexities that we won't be covering this morning. However, you will get the basics you'll need to set up, maintain, and audit a register. So I hope that fulfills your needs this morning. I will ask you to do a couple of little tasks as we go through. So it'd be helpful if you had a pencil and paper handy, and I'll post the slides that we see today and some additional resources out to you afterwards. So, who is this guy and why is he talking to us? Well, a little bit about me. I've been a head for a number of years in education. I'm currently a governor at a local primary school, and I'm also an inspector. And it's in that role that I wanted to present this because it saddens me. So many otherwise excellent or outstanding schools get the SCR wrong. So we're going to ensure today, hopefully, that your school isn't one of those. I thank you to those of you who answered my email yesterday about a little detail about yourself. If you haven't filled that in, or anyone that is with you who hasn't filled that in, if you could do that for me, I'd be very grateful. We'll just take a moment to let anyone do that now. Okay, let's start with a little bit of historical context so that you can understand why all this is important at the moment. In 2002, in Soham, Cambridge, 10-year-old best friends Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman left a family barbecue to buy some sweets. They never came. And just a couple of hours before they were reported missing, Holly's mum took this photograph of the two little girls wearing their favourite Manchester United shirts. And it became a heartbreaking image seared into the public consciousness of the time. After a huge search, a guy called Ian Huntley, a man they trusted and a caretaker at the local school, was arrested and eventually convicted of their murders. And there were crucial failings that let him get a job close to children. After Huntley's conviction, it was revealed he'd previously been investigated for sexual offences with underage girls, for rape and for burglary. And by 2001, his proven and alleged criminal activities had been reported to Humberside Police on 10 separate occasions, and also to the social services on 5 more. In 2001, he responded to a job advert for the position of caretaker at Soham College. And he applied for this using the alias Ian Nixon. And no form of background check was conducted before or after his job interview. And although he lacked much experience in this type of work, his application was successful. And this, of course, led to his fateful interaction with Holly and Jessica. There was national outcry, and there followed an inquiry chaired by Sir Michael Bishard. The inquiry recommended the implementation of a mandatory registration scheme for people working with children and also vulnerable adults like the elderly and mentally handicapped. And this recommendation later led to the foundation of the Independent Safety Authority. The findings also suggested the national system should be implemented for police forces so they could share intelligence information, and that all police forces should follow a clear code of practice on record. And the findings ultimately led to the tightening of the barriers around the Criminal Records Bureau system, including compulsory checks into potential criminal backgrounds of people who apply to work with children. And you may have heard of the early versions, List 99, the CRB check, and so on. And it's because of Huntley and those like him that we check any adult who wishes to do regular work with children. And this is a mandatory requirement, and a failure to do so potentially exposes your children to danger and will certainly result in an inspection failure. And as I said earlier, incomplete checks and wrong registers are one of the biggest single causes of regulatory failings in inspection. Now, to show who's been checked and what checks have been done, we put the information on our single central register. If you're new to this, it's going to seem very complex at first, but hopefully we can help you with the key messages. It's not something to take lightly. There won't be many quick fire one-liners to keep you amused as we go, I'm afraid, and you might even find that your head hurts from time to time. However, by understanding some of what's needed, you're going to be helping your school to be a safer place. You can find the key information on this topic in the Department of Education's Keeping Children Safe in Education Advice, September 2019, although just a few days ago the September 2020 version was released, and you can look at that, though it's not actually valid until September. If you're part of an independent school belonging to one of the key associations and inspected by ISI, then all the information you need is contained in what's called Document 1.2, Commentary on the Regulatory Requirements, and that's in section 4, suitability of staff. And if you're working in a state school or academy, then look at the latest version of Ofsted's Inspecting Safeguarding in Early Years, Education and Skill Settings. If you currently work for a school, you should have been asked to read a copy of that latest Keeping Children Safe in Education document, which explains the issues relating to safeguarding. If you haven't, please demand to see a copy and hope that your school is not inspected before you read it, as again, that's a failure. You should have signed to say you've read it. Now, I'll refer to this document quite a lot as we go through, but to save the mouthful of its title, I'm just going to call it Casey. Before we get into the real meat of this topic, I need you to understand that everything we're talking about today is part of your school's wider safeguarding culture. And a particular part of that is the notion of safer recruitment, which you'll find in part 3 of the guidance. And there are a number of responsibilities upon schools, and the main one is for governing bodies and proprietors in independent schools to prevent or pose a risk from harm from working with children, to check staff who work with children, to make sure all volunteers are appropriately supervised, and to have written recruitment and selection policies in place. Does your school have a safer recruitment policy? If it does, read it. If it doesn't, I would highly recommend building one as a manual of what to do when you're recruiting staff. It ensures that nothing gets missed and that all colleagues are acting in a consistent way. I've got a sample one which I can share with you a little bit later if that helps. Who do we need to check then? Well, there are 3 broad categories of people we need to check before they come into our schools. Firstly, all staff working at the school, including supply teachers. Secondly, others whose work brings them into regular contact with children, and that might mean there's certain sorts of volunteers. And then members of your governing body, or in some independent schools, the proprietors and so on. So, bearing that in mind, let's take 2 minutes to decide which of these people we should be checking before they come into school or not, and why not. So as a reminder, we check all staff working at the school, including supply teachers and others work who brings them into regular contact with children. Have a little read through those, decide who we should be checking and who we should not. I'll come back to you in just 1 second. Have you had a chance to think about those? Let's do some thinking about those then. So first of all staff working at the school, including supply teachers and others whose work brings them into regular contact with children is the definition. Teachers, well, definitely, they're definitely working at the school. They're definitely in contact with children, aren't they? So yes, you always need to check your teachers. I'll tell you what checks a little bit later on, but you need to know that if you get an application from a teacher, they need checking in certain ways. A parent volunteer who hears children read. Well, yes, because this person is doing work in school that brings them into regular contact with children. So yes, they need checking too, even though not actually employed by the school. A local charity worker coming in to do an assembly. Well, they know they're not employed by the school, they're not regular, so therefore they don't actually need checking. They don't need to go on your register. The electrician, called in one Wednesday morning, there's a faulty light switch, in they come, fix the switch, away they go. And again, no, just like the charity worker, they're not actually employed by the school, they're not working with children, it's not regular, no, they don't need to be there. They don't need to be on your list. The cricket club coach, well again, yes, if they're coming in each week, they've got regular contact with children, they're employed, or whether they're coming in as a year, they need checking. Your school secretary, yes, even if she doesn't have a frontline job with children, she's employed at the school and therefore needs checks. And your supply teacher, yes, again, obviously in front of children, they need checks too. Supply teachers, I'll refer to on several occasions as we go forward. They have a whole different range of things that need doing for them. They need all the checks, but actually their own supply agency do those rather than the school. But the school needs to be aware of them and prove that they've happened. And I'll say that several times going forward. So yes, the supply teachers need to be on your list and your list of checks. So we said all staff working at the school, including supply teachers and others whose work brings them into regular contact with children. I hope we've got that message across. Specific roles falling into that sort of category are all directly employed staff, those on your payroll, including those with roles not directly working with children. That includes your admin staff, for example. It's all supply and agency staff who've been employed for a reasonable length of time. And as I said, these people have other rules relating to them. Schools are required to confirm the agencies carried out all the checks, but I'll go through that again a bit later. Your short-term supply teachers, their agency will do them too. Individuals who are employed to provide additional teaching or coaching, so this might be visiting sports coaches and music teachers, they need checks doing on them. Any regular contract staff, people you hire in, such as cleaners and caterers, if they're with you on for the long haul, they need checks too. And volunteers who work with pupils on a regular basis, including those on what's called regulated activity. And the key term to bear in mind here is those that are undertaking regulated activity. This is a really important phrase, and I'm going to explain this now about 5 times, different ways round, inside out and upside down, to make sure you get it. Regulated activity means not only do you have to do standard checks, there are additional things you have to do for them as well. So what is regulated activity? Well, a person will be considered to be in regular activity if their work means that they are responsible for teaching, training, instructing, caring for, or supervising children. So that's teaching, training, instructing, caring for, or supervising. They're also in regulated activity if they're carried out paid or unsupervised unpaid work with children, or if they're involved in any form of intimate or personal care with children, or overnight activity, even if that's only a one-off and not on a regular basis. So this means anyone interacting with children on a regular basis, or anyone involved with intimate care or overnight activities, even if just a one-off. Put another way, I think all regular work for schools with opportunity for contact with children should be considered regulated activity, except, because there are some exceptions, work by supervised volunteers, which doesn't entail personal care, of course. Work by a kennel or temporary contractors, so that's our visiting plumber, for example, popping in for a quick one-off job. Work by pupils for other pupils, except for those in the early years, by the way. And that's known as the peer exemption. And that might include people like someone coming down from your local senior school to do Year 10 work experience, or Duke of Edinburgh helpers. They're not paid and they're not unsupervised. So that's an exception. And we mentioned this word personal, relevant personal care and so on. And personal care is always regulated activity. And that includes helping a child for reasons of age, illness, disability, with things like eating, drinking, or in connection with toileting, washing, bathing, and dressing. And care like that is always regulated activity. Considerations of regularity and supervision don't apply. If they're involved in intimate care, it's always regulated activity and separate checks need doing. Any regular, unsupervised teaching, training, instructing, caring for, or supervising children is regulated activity. And so is providing advice or guidance for children on well-being and driving a vehicle just for children. So this includes people like any mentors you might have in school, minibus drivers, and those sort of people as well. If you've got frontline exposure to children, you're in regulated activity. This is the stuff that makes your head hurt, but I'll try and keep it as simple as I can. There is a simple way of working this out for yourself, because there are some questions you can ask to decide whether someone's in regulated activity. And we need to know that because we need to know what checks to do on them. So, is the activity they will do work? So a person just visiting the head, for example, or coming in to look at your own child while they have their piano lesson, that's not regular, that's not work. So you don't need to have those people checked. When we say the word regular, we mean that we look at frequency. It's got to be once a week or more often. It's got to be on 4 or more days in a 30-day period, or at all, ever, overnight. And will, of course, it give rise to contact with children, even if it probably won't happen. Let's say for someone in your accounts staff, opportunity to mingle with children is the important thing. And we're only talking here about people who are actually dealing with the school. So if you hire your hockey pitches out on an evening to the local club and someone pops in just to negotiate that with a caretaker, they wouldn't need checking that sort of thing. It's just people dealing with the people who are in the school itself. So if the answer to all those questions you can see on the screen is yes, the person's working in regulated activity. But again, there are some exceptions. You don't have to check all volunteers unless they're in regulated activity, or unless they're in personal care, or unless they're unsupervised. And you don't have to check visiting contractors who are definitely not working with groups of children, not involved in personal care, and only come on site infrequently on a short-term temporary basis. However, under different guidance, your visiting contractors and volunteers should always be asked to sign in and out of your visitors book. And I would advise that all visits to school are supervised or chaperoned at all times. Now, we'll talk more about other regular visitors, such as governors and supply staff, in a little while. But as you can see, this is about children having frontline opportunity for contact with children, and it's about grooming. So basically, if you ask yourself, does this give an opportunity for grooming, you're on the right lines. Right, let's summarise some of that. People who will have regular access to our children are going to need some sort of checks before they can start to be in our school. Those checks have got to be recorded on a register. That's the single central register. Everyone needs checks. Anyone involved in regular unsupervised teaching, training, instructing, caring for, or supervising children is in what's called regulated activity, and this needs some additional checks. Right, so thinking about that regular unsupervised teaching, training, instructing, caring for, supervising, which of these do you think would classify as regulated activity? And again, take a moment just to jot these down and see what you think. Just give you a few more seconds on that. So the questions we were asking ourselves to do with these guys was all to do with frequency, supervision, possibilities of intimate care, and so on. So let's have a little look at what we've got. Someone running a weekly chess club. It doesn't matter whether they are a member of staff or whether they're a visiting tutor or coach or whatever. It doesn't matter whether they're paid or not. These guys have got regular, unsupervised access to your children. The fact that they're showing chess is still counted as teaching or training, so they need the extra checks because they're in regulated activity. Someone assisting at a residential for a weekend. Yes, it doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter how many times they're doing it. Once is enough. If it's overnight and with children, they need the extra checks. Supervised parent volunteer helping at a bun sale. Well, we said no, you don't have to check all volunteers unless they're in regulated activity, unless they're involved in personal care of pupils, or unless they're unsupervised. This one's not regular. They're not working. They are being supervised already. So again, they can pop in and out. And as long as someone's there to look after them, they don't need those extra checks. They don't need any checks at all, actually, as a supervised volunteer. A local vicar leading an assembly. Once a term, no, that's not regular. And as with any other visitor, they would be supervised, I hope, as well. In fact, you may well find that members of your local clergy have already got their own checks done, but you still need to treat them as a visitor and look after them accordingly. You can't just take their DBS and let them roam around freely. Leading a lunchtime musical ensemble. Well, yes, again, this is regular. It's instruction with children, and so it counts in the same way as teaching does. And finally, our annual fire extinguisher checks by a contractor. And no, you don't have to check visiting contractors who are definitely not working with groups of children, not involved in personal care, and only come onto site infrequently or on a short-term basis. So this person isn't in regulated activity, and in fact wouldn't need checking if they were being supervised by the caretaker anyway. So I hope that gives you some clarity on, basically we check lots and lots of different people. Some people need more than checks than others. Now, there are two regulations relating to all. One insists that you must make all the relevant checks. As we've seen, there are different things to check for different types of worker to prove that they are a suitable person to work with children. And another regulation that looks at whether you've correctly logged all the checks you've made in your register. So what on earth should I be checking for? Well, before you allow a person to start work with you, you should have seen and checked their identity. They may need a barred list check to prove they're not barred from working with children. And that's the one that relates to regulated activity. If they're in regulated activity, they need a barred list check. They're going to need an enhanced DBS check. They may well need, if they're giving instruction or teaching, a prohibition from teaching check. They're going to need a check of professional history and qualifications, a check of their medical fitness, and this is one that a lot of schools miss out, a check to establish their right to work in the UK, and then there's some additional checks for those in some roles and those living or working outside of the UK. And as I say, you should have all these things done before you confirm their appointment. And lots of them, like establishing ID and seeing qualifications, can be done when they attend interview. But any job offer you make subsequently should be subject to satisfactory completion of all the other checks. Actually, there is one area of wriggle room regarding those DBS checks, and that's known as the 3-month rule. That is, if your candidate is coming from another UK school where they have a current enhanced DBS check, they might not need another one if there's a gap of less than 3 months between them leaving that job and starting with you. So, for example, if they leave a job at a school down the road on 31st of August and start with you on 1st September, that would count. However, verifying that the checks have been done is fraught with difficulties, and I was always advise you to get a fresh, up-to-date check. Excuse me a second. So, for each of those things we just listed there, the SCR must include details of what's been seen and when it was seen. So let's go through those now. The DBS checks. Different rules apply to different types of people. Now, as a rule of thumb, everyone working in a school needs an enhanced DBS check, but only some people need a barred list check. And there's a lovely flowchart in the new Casey document on page 43, if you have access to it, which I'll break into chunks for you now to show you who needs what sort of check. New members of staff working with children in a school, so they're regular and with opportunity for contact with children, need a full check of both the DBS and the barred list, unless you're using the 3-month rule. But even then, you've got to do a separate barred list check. Leave that on the screen for a second. So you'll get all the slides afterwards. Volunteers. If they may come across children and you can't guarantee they will always be supervised, then get a full enhanced check with the barring list check. Now, the next people I'm going to show you are actually not your employees, so checks would be done by their employer. Your job as a school is to verify that the employer's checks are appropriately done. So contractors. If they're in for a job in the holidays when there's definitely no children around, it's not a problem. If they might come across children, ensure they're checked, and you could get away with having your caretaker supervise them for a short one-off job. Other people in teaching roles should be checked by their agency. And again, as a school, it's your job to check that those checks have been done. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Now, an enhanced DBS check includes a check on the list of those barred from working with children and vulnerable adults, but barred lists checks can and should be done separately in some cases. And let's have a look at when that will be the case. So you should make a separate barred list check, even if you don't get a DBS check, in the event that a new enhanced disclosure is required but not received in advance of a member of staff starting work. If you haven't got the certificates, go and do a barred list check anyway. If there's a pre-existing enhanced DBS check and you're accepting it under that 3-month rule, then you can see the certificate, but you still need a barred list checklist doing separately. Some people subscribe to what's called the DBS update service. So they've got a mobile DBS they take with them. And again, you can accept that, but you must do a separate barred list check for those people too. And these checks should be in place for everyone who doesn't work at your school, including your staff and such people as visiting music teachers, game staff or therapists, even if they're paid by the parents and not your school, because they're still in front of your kids. When we talk about staff, we mean a whole range of people: teachers, peripatetic people, coaches, part-time staff, students such as sixth formers, administrative staff, caretakers and other ancillary staff, staff appointed from overseas, pupils paid to work at the school, for example, in after-school care. But you need to get it right, because the DBS is not allowed to provide barred list information on anyone, including volunteers, who's not in or seeking to enter regulated activity. That's why you need to know that regulated activity list so well. Okay, you have to get it right. Section 7 of the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act of 2006 says that if you knowingly take on someone into regulated activity that's barred, there's big penalties at stake. So please do try and get that right. So that's DBS. You've got to get DBS checks. You may well need a barred list check as well. The next thing to look at is identity. Now, an application for a criminal record DBS check will always include an identity check. And in this context, the methods for identity checking, are in the detailed guidance from the DBS. It typically includes official documents such as passport, driving license, birth certificate, other photographic ID, together with evidence of address, like a utility bill, a bank statement or similar. And Casey provides a link to the full guidance, which also helpfully covers how to check the identity of those lacking the usual official documents. For those such as supply staff or agency cleaners who are not contracted to you, they should have been checked by their agency, but it's still good practice to see some photo ID when they report on the first day, so you can verify you've got the right person on site. Next one is medical fitness. And the DFE says schools must satisfy themselves of the medical fitness of staff to carry out the duties of the post they're applying for. And now, recent years, medical fitness now includes both physical and mental health. So that's quite a declaration to make. There's no particular methodology described. Common means you see in schools are through asking prospective employees to self-declare their fitness for the role or to complete a medical questionnaire. And if needed, that could be followed up by a request for medical advice with the consent of the applicant. I must draw your attention to one consideration relating to disability. Let me read for you now the DFE advice to you regarding disability. It says, disabled staff make an important contribution to the overall school curriculum, both as effective employees and in raising aspirations of disabled pupils and educating non-disabled pupils about the reality of disability. Many disabled people will be medically fit to teach, though under the Equality Act of 2010, employers may have to make reasonable adjustments to enable disabled people to carry out their duties effectively. So don't confuse fitness with disability. The thing we should be looking at is previous employment history, CV, references and all that. And Casey states that employers should always take up written information about employment history. And again, it doesn't prescribe the method by which it's done, so you've got a bit of discretion there. There was previous statutory guidance in 2007, which isn't there anymore, which recommended the use of applicant forms as a best practice. I think that's still good guidance. And if you're doing that, be looking for contradictory or incomplete information. And if you choose to interview that candidate, you must probe those gaps or anomalies. References should always be sought from the candidate's current employer. And where there's no current employer, then you must get verification of the most recent period of employment, and reasons for leaving should be obtained. We know that some employers are not happy to provide references, so you still need to prove where they were and when they were there. And again, Casey doesn't specify a number of references that you have to take, but if you read the guidance, you'll see it all refers to them in the plural, implying that there will be more than one. And hopefully I don't have to tell you that you should never take an open, to whom it may concern kind of reference. The next thing to look at is qualifications, and the phrase is qualifications where appropriate. So I suppose it'll be appropriate to check qualifications where the school stipulates or an individual claims qualifications as part of the recruitment process. Qualifications should be checked in advance of appointment, and you need sight of the original certificates, not scans or copies. And in some schools, I guess some ancillary roles don't require formal qualifications, so you could just write NA, not applicable, in your register, and that will be okay. Another one to check is the right to work in the UK. The rules for employing migrant workers changed about 10 years ago, so any employer who employs someone who is subject to immigration control and isn't entitled to undertake the work can face huge fines. You'd be pleased to know the Home Office has got some guidance on right to work checks and how to carry them out for different people from different countries. Overseas checks where appropriate, including professional sanctions from European countries. So if, because of a person living or having lived outside the UK, a DBS check isn't considered sufficient to establish their suitability to work in a school, because a UK check, of course, only covers those on the UK National Police database, not those committed abroad, then schools must carry out additional checks, and it's the governor's job to determine what those are. And again, there's guidance issued by the DfE to help you decide what they should be. But again, they must all be done before the person starts work. And that standard applies both to foreign nationals and to UK nationals who've been abroad and are returning from overseas. And there's a teacher services section on .gov.uk to help guide you through those. Prohibition from teaching. Schools must check that anyone employed or engaged to carry out teaching work in schools isn't subject to a prohibition order. So this clearly applies to teachers, but also to other sorts of people as well. And it's irrelevant whether the person can wave at you a qualified teacher status certificate or a teacher reference number. It's irrelevant whether they're peripatetic or whether they're charged by the school to parents. It must be checked for everyone who's in teaching work. And by teaching, we mean things such as planning and preparing lessons and courses for pupils, delivering and preparing lessons. And by the way, delivering this year includes delivering lessons through distance learning and computer aided stuff. Anyone who's assessing the development, progress and attainment of pupils. Anyone reporting on the development, progress and attainment of pupils. So you can see that can incorporate a wide variety of people. Now, there's no need to check if the person will be working under the direction and supervision of a qualified teacher or someone else that the head has nominated as suitable. But I would advise caution with your TAs. Schools vary in how they deploy teaching assistants and in the amount of responsibility and autonomy they allow them. So you should decide on a case-by-case basis in the light of practice relating to your teaching assistants whether they require such checks. I would advise you to think about how much they will be responsible for children in an unsupervised capacity. And similar reason, I suppose, would also apply to those who you might hire in as assistant sports coaches or whatever. To my mind, most TAs and sports coaches get left alone with children fairly regularly and so should be checked. Even if you think the supervised now, getting them checked has the advantage of giving flexibility in their deployment later. But beware, you're not supposed to check those who legally don't require it. So you do need a school policy and you need to stick to it. Okay, lots of you are involved with academies and independent schools today, so this one will be of importance to you. Prohibition from management, and so this includes independent schools and also academies and free schools. So these schools must check on whether staff appointed to management positions are subject to what's called a Section 128 direction. A quick alert here, in the last couple of years, the DfE has reversed its previous advice. So this check now applies to staff promoted internally to management positions. And certainly ISI have inspected on this basis for about 2 or 3 years now. But it has caught some schools out. They forget that internal promotions need checking. What sort of staff would you consider to be in a management position? Well, head teachers certainly. Anybody on the senior leadership team, including your non-teaching staff like your school business manager or Bursar. Teaching positions with significant departmental headship. And yes, questions arise as to what departmental headship would look like, and there isn't a specific definition. Again, ISI inspectors have been told to check that the school's been reasonable about it. You also need to check proprietors in an independent school, and whatever sort of school you're in, including maintained schools, your governors need a check. A Section 128 direction disqualifies a person from holding or continuing to hold office as a governor of a maintained school. And then the last one you need to be looking at is disqualification from childcare. This is an early years provision on the whole. So you have to do pre-appointment checks for relevant staff, leaders and managers. And it relates to those working in EYFS or in care of under 8s, for example, in before or after school care. So it's not one you'll see on a secondary school register. They won't need one at all. But if you've got an EYFS or younger children, you will need this. It's also not a one-off check, unlike the others. It needs refreshing from time to time. And again, the DfE hasn't put any time frame in place for this, so you can exercise reasonable discretion. As an indication, annually will look sensible to me, and some schools just do this by self-declaration, getting the staff to declare that nothing's changed since last time. So, checks for all prohibitions, sanctions and restrictions can be carried out by logging onto the secure DfE sign-in portal via the Teachers Services webpage at .gov.uk. You can Google that. Right. So we've all been recruiting, ready for September. Let's have a think now which checks which members of staff would require. Now, as a clue, everyone needs ID checks. Everyone needs an enhanced DBS check, as they're in regular employees with opportunity for contact with children. They're going to need a full check of both DBS and barred list. We always need to establish the right to work in the UK and to check references and CVs and medical suitability. But there are some blank columns here. Who needs the other columns completing? Have a think about what you're going to need to complete for each person you can see on this register and why. I'm going to give you 10 minutes for this one. If you finish early, get yourself a cuppa, stretch your legs, take a loo break, and we'll see you back here in about 10 minutes. Right, we'll make a start. So we left thinking about what checks our new staff might need. So let's have a little look at those. So I filled in the sheet for you so you can see what's what. In terms of qualifications, one would expect these posts to need some specific qualifications, be they PGCE, accountancy or NBQ childcare. Possibly not for your cleaner. Overseas checks, again, only those who've been living overseas. And you decide how long ago that needs to have been, actually. Some people only go for a year. Some people want 5 years back history. You can decide how long since they were overseas, what you would check for. Prohibition from teaching, that's there for all those who will be giving instruction or looking at the progress of pupils. The prohibition from management, again, there's no governors here who would need checking for everybody. So we're just talking for independent schools or academies here. It's those with SLT or significant departmental responsibilities. Disqualification from childcare. More discussion possibly needed here depending on the nature of the role and of your school. So for example, our Key Stage 2 teacher wouldn't need it if they were only ever working in Key Stage 2. But in a mixed age school that has an EYFS, where in typical primary style where anybody could be asked to cover in any class at any given moment, then they've got the potential to be in front of those younger children. They would need that disqualification from childcare check doing. Our school business manager or bursar, they do need that check doing, even though they're not involved with teaching, because they can be down regularly checking on toilets, outdoor play provision, whatever else it might be. They're frequently in and out of the EYFS unit, and so they would need that doing too, as would our cleaner. They could be around any time, mopping up little bits of mess here and there in any age group, so they would need that doing as well. Our music teacher, possibly not. Most music teachers tend to work with children sort of over 5 and 6 and so on. But if they had access to the youngest pupils, then yes, they would. Okay, so that's your regular employees. What about other people coming into your school who don't actually work for you? Well, as I said, supply staff are subject to different rules as they're not your staff. You're just borrowing them from another company. When we talk about supply staff, there is actually a particular definition, and that definition is employed, so offered for supply by an employment business. So not all third-party staff are necessarily supply. An employment business is effectively a supply or temping agency, isn't it? And don't forget, supply staff could perform any function. It's not just teachers. You could have secretarial supply, catering supply, all kinds of things too. The key thing here is that schools must receive written confirmation from the relevant agency that the required checks have been carried out to the relevant extent for the job they're going to be doing. So that will be identity, enhanced disclosure, right to work, barred list if needed, prohibition from teaching if needed, prohibition from management of an independent school if needed, qualifications, overseas checks, and so on. When that person comes into your work, the school must see the criminal record certificate, whether or not it discloses any information. And I know as a head, in a hurry to get someone in front of the class at 8:30 on the morning, that's the sort of thing, you rush people in, you don't always get that done. It must be done. The school's not required to retain a copy of those certificates on file. Agencies, of course, might operate the 3-month rule because they have people going from school to school to school on the same DBS certificate. But it's up to them to get the barred list checks done as they move from place to place. Additionally, Casey tells us that the agency should take up references, obtain a declaration of medical fitness, check previous employment history, and check whether that person is disqualified from childcare as appropriate. Now, the identity of your supply staff must be checked on arrival at a school by you to ensure that they're the same person on whom the checks have been carried out. And again, that's something that a lot of schools don't do. Governors are another form of visitor to the school. If you're an independent school, your chair of governors and individual proprietors are checked by the DfE, and therefore they're not your checks. They don't need to be on your SCR. However, don't forget to tell the DfE who these people are. For other sort of more regular governors, if you will, they do have to be checked across all sorts of schools. They need at least an enhanced DBS, and if they might be involved in regulated activity, then they need a barred list check too. They don't, however, need all the other checks that regular employees do. You must undertake prohibition from management, right to work, and any relevant overseas checks, and they should go on your register. Certainly, looking in maintained schools, often the authority will take up more, do more checks, but again, they don't have to go on the school's register because the authority's done those. Contractors working on site on a regular basis or a prolonged basis must also be checked. And again, as they're not your employee, their company must do this. And as with supply staff, you should see the evidence. And the usual way to ensure it's been done is through obtaining written confirmation from the employer. And this should be retained for inspection purposes. Schools aren't required to include employees of other organisations apart from supply agencies on their register, though you can do it if you wish. And I would always recommend doing it. If you've done some checks, then it's always a good audit trail to have them on your register. And again, those minimum checks done by the agency will be barred list check if you're in regulated activity, DBS check appropriate level. You do the identity check on arrival, and any other role-specific checks, such as disqualification from childcare if needed. The employees of contractors who are working at the school on a long-term basis, so that might be people like caterers or cleaners, should, depending on what they're doing, how much exposure they've got to pupils, what their role is, how well they're being supervised, and so on. Generally be subject to the same checks that you would have put your own staff through had you been employing someone. So you'd expect the agency to do all those for you. And again, you must check identity on arrival. Please ensure your receptionists are trained to do this. Now, the DfE has advised that the written confirmation of checks by the contractor company should contain actual details of actual names of actual individuals, all the checks that have been done and the dates. So a general letter saying, we always check all our employees will not do. You need something related to that particular person. Self-employed workers, typically many visiting music teachers, for example. You've got discretion to make a reasonable decision when it comes to vetting about when to treat a self-employed worker as a member of staff rather than a contractor in terms of the sorts of checks you do. The inspection expectation is that if a person's in regulated activity in the school, you normally give them all the checks that your staff would get. So this could have the strange effect that someone, for example, like an exam invigilator who only works for a week is treated as staff because of their exposure to children, but a plumber who does a week's job isn't. They're treated as a contractor. So you can have some anomalies there, but you get that clear in your head, which sort of vetting you would go for. There's also visiting professionals who come into schools. We're talking here about people employed by third parties such as psychologists, nurses, dentists, other public sector staff, and they will have been checked by their employing organisation. It's not necessary for schools to see their DBS check, although sometimes it's offered. They need only obtain written confirmation that it and the other appropriate checks have been performed. And most of those public organisations will actually send a letter to you in advance without even asking for it. Again, you should check their identity when an individual arrives to make sure that imposters don't have access to your children. So get your receptionist to make sure they see photo ID from your inspection team when they arrive. It'll give your receptionist a sense of power, and it'll give the message to the inspection team that you're taking all this seriously. Same rules also apply to people like CCF instructors, sports referees, and other professionals supplied by central bodies. Student teachers, unless they're employed directly by the school, will have been checked by the university, and so you don't need to complete your checks apart from identity with them. I'm not going to go into regulations today relating to things like host families used to host children on sports or language exchanges. They've got a huge section all to themselves, nor visiting speakers who might fall under this system, and also that to prevent. They've all got massive sections all on their own, and that's a bit more advanced. But I will remind you that any volunteers, whether they be washing pots or helping on a day trip, must be supervised and mustn't undertake any personal care. If they do, that immediately becomes regulated activity, and so they must be fully checked and on your register. Right, having worked out who you should be checking and what you need to check for each of them, you then need to record all this information, and that takes us onto the register. Now, there's no statutory format for maintaining an SCR, and it can be held manually or electronically. I personally would advocate an electronic approach, and use of something like Excel allows for maintaining and updating the information to be done really easily. It also enables different categories of staff to be recorded on different worksheets. It means you can sort things into date order, type of employee order, and all sorts of other things. You can even add simple hyperlinks, for example, to go straight to their safeguarding training certificates or something like that if you want to be really clever. There are some commercial systems available which some schools use, but these can be expensive, and you must also ensure that as the regulations change each year, and they do change each year, that you get appropriate updates from your supplier. Ideally, keep your SCR really simple, and this can mean recording just things like the dates on which checks have been undertaken or certificates seen. It's not necessary or desirable from an inspection perspective for schools to include additional personal data, although this helps with proof and internal checks. I would suggest that schools consider recording any extra information like personal details used for employment purposes, the initials of the person who's undertaking the check, any notes relevant to the checks made elsewhere, for example, on a cover sheet in each member of staff's file. And that's an approach that's adopted by many schools I've seen on inspection. On inspection, an inspector will take a sample of records from your SCR and look at the relevant employee file to verify that what's been recorded matches what's in the file, so they will see all extra information. Who goes on the register? All staff, including teacher trainees who are salaried by you, agency and third-party supply staff who work at the school, and for independent schools, all members of the proprietor or governing body. In the case of academies and free schools, this means the members and trustees of the Academy Trust. So you need to list all those people and all the checks done on a register. It might look something like this. You need columns to show when the checks were made, all the certificates received for each person. You need a column for their name, for the post to which they were appointed, the date on which their appointment started, the date on which you checked their identity, the date on which the qualifications were checked, and again, that can be interview, don't forget. Also put NA if not applicable, and that's NA for governors, by the way, too. The date on which the enhanced DBS certificate was seen by the school, and that's seen, not applied for, seen by the school. The date on which the Bardless check was done, the date on which the right to work in the UK was checked, the date on which the overseas checks were received, and again, NA if not applicable. And do use NA, don't leave blanks. That just invites someone to think something's been forgotten. You need the date on which prohibition from teaching was checked, and again, NA if not applicable. Date on which prohibition from management was checked, NA if not applicable. Date on which references was seen, and that's a non-applicable for governors too. Date on which employment history was checked, another non-applicable for governors. The date on which medical fitness was checked, and again, NA for governors. And if you have an EYFS, you can add a column about disqualification for childcare, or again, that wouldn't be needed in senior schools. You can add any other information that your school deems important, but again, these are often best placed in the staff file, and you're better keeping the registers crisp, clean, and simple. If you do want to add staff initials, my advice would be to do it in a separate column, not in the same column as the date. This allows for better sorting later. And also some schools have reference 1 and reference 2 in separate columns, so they can double check when those references were all received. If you've got supply staff in, do them on a separate sheet or a separate tab or a separate section. And for them, you need the date of receipt of confirmation that their identity was checked by the supply agency. You also need a column to show receipt of confirmation that their enhanced DBS was checked by the supply agency. And I would also suggest a box either here or in their file to show when you actually saw their ID. Now, with all this information, people get a bit stressed about GDPR. Schools and colleges don't have to keep copies of DBS certificates in order to fulfil the duty to do with the register. To help schools and colleges, the DfE have said, in order to comply with the Data Protection Act, if you do need to retain a copy for any reason, do not retain it for longer than 6 months. Do not retain things for longer than 6 months. You're not required to actually keep them at all. A copy of other documents, things such as identity, right to work, qualifications, should be kept, and they should be on the personnel file for as long as that person works with you. Now, it is a job for someone in your organisation to regularly audit the SCR, and we're going to look at that now. So here's a typical single central register. Take a look at it. Bear in mind, we should have seen everything to do with this register before these people started work. What do you notice? Now, when I inspect, the way I do this is, I look at the start date and I check that all the checks were done before they actually started work. Then I look again at the job post and work out which checks actually needed to have been done to make sure that nothing was missed. So again, I'm going to give you 10 minutes here to go through this and look at what's been done, what's been missed, have the right things been done based upon the notes we just read out earlier. Okay, I'll come back to you in a short while. Okay, I will move on, and then we can keep it all going rather than sitting around. So let's look at that sheet then. The question was, here are our employees, here's our register. Have we got it all right so far? And the reason we know that is that someone in your organisation ought to be checking the register that exists from time to time. Depends on the size of your school. If you've only got a couple of employees a year, once a year will probably do. My previous employer had over 500 members of staff, and it ran to pages and pages and pages, and we checked it termly to make sure we got all the right people there. So do keep checking it from time to time, because it's only then you pick up the little errors. So let's make a start. Norman, our teacher. There was a little error on his, and that is his DBS and barred list date appeared a couple of days after his start date. Is that a problem? Well, potentially yes, because that means he hasn't been checked for 2 days while he's been ill. However, looking at the dates, it's September. We often start our contracts in September. To be honest, looking at the September coming up, I don't think term starts until, let's say, the 7th. We've probably got inset days before that. So if there haven't been any children in school, it's been inset, it's actually not a problem. But what I would advise you to do is put a little note somewhere on his file to say we were aware of this, it wasn't a problem, here's what we did about it. You know, it was an inset day, there were no children, and that sort of covers you for that sort of thing. Disqualification from childcare for Norman. Again, depends on your circumstances. I haven't highlighted that as an error, but again, if you're working in a through school where your Key Stage 2 teachers could potentially be working in EYFS, then they would need checking as well. Serena, she's Director of Creative Arts Faculty. That sounds like quite a grand job, doesn't it? And you'll notice if this was an independent school, she hasn't been checked for prohibition from management. Again, it's a common one that people forget to put in there. In fact, nothing's been put in there at all. So we've got a blank, which means it either hasn't been checked or has been checked and forgotten to be written down. So we need to rectify that straight away. Our African rugby coach, always exciting when you take people from overseas in roles like this. Things to worry about there. Again, late DBS comes in on the 6th. Again, if term starting on the 7th, that's not a problem. You'll also notice that in the barred list, that was done separately. Remember we said we could do barred lists separately if we needed it to, if the certificates hadn't arrived. So the barred list was done before term started. So we were just literally waiting for the actual certificates. And there are ways around that, which I'll explain to you in a few moments. One that's a bigger issue is that there's no prohibition from teaching check down there. In fact, they put NA. And again, there are independent schools particularly out there who don't get this. They think that people like coaches and peripatetic musicians aren't teachers, therefore they don't need prohibition from teaching. Anyone involved in giving instruction, in that list we mentioned earlier, be that online, be that by checking results and progress, or actually giving instruction like the chess teacher, is a teacher as far as this check is concerned, so make sure it's done. Next one down is Mahir, our bursar, member of the SLT. And again, if this was an independent school, we would expect to see a management check in there as well. Again, it's very often forgotten. We've also got a check in disqualification from childcare there. Remember, I said that's quite important for someone like a bursar who has access to all areas in a school and can be in and out of any given part of the school at any given part of the day. So they need to make sure that they're absolutely as checked as they can be. Sally's our EYFS TA. And again, little error there. We'll notice that we've got a late DBS and barred list again. And even if term did start on the 7th this time, this is the 8th. So this is properly late. And again, there are ways around that, but that shouldn't be happening. She should not have been allowed to start in school without action being taken, with no DBS and barred list check being done. She's also got no disqualification from childcare written down. There isn't even NA in there, so we don't know if that's been forgotten, missed off, or what. So again, that should be in place before she's allowed to start work. We've got a volunteer down here, Karanjeet. Now, if you're not familiar with younger years, the phrase YR is the designation we give to reception year. So these guys are 4 years old. So again, that tells you the sort of things she should be looking at. She's a volunteer, she's not on the payroll, but we have done some checks, so we have included it on the register. We can see the start date. We've done the ID check. We've got the qualifications and so on sorted out, and the DBS is all done. However, we don't know anything about this woman at all. We've not got a reference. We've not got a CV. We've not got a medical. Even though she's a volunteer, we're putting her in front of our children. It's our duty to make sure we know something about her and her background. And even if she's someone on the staff's sister or something like that, she still needs checking. You still need to go through the motions for everybody and get all that information for people. Also, we haven't done the disqualification from childcare for her either. She's working with 4-year-olds. That should be done. We've got Pete, our music Perry. Again, he's working with children on a one-to-one basis, on a regular basis. Did you pick up this one? The ID check, 3rd December 71. Again, a very common error, particularly with admin staff this time of year when you've got lots and lots of people joining the school. They're trying to rush to get all the checks done, rush to get everything written down. Transposition of digits, very common indeed, and anyone could have picked that up quite happily. In terms of pass or fail if you register for something like that, inspectors will look at that, appreciate that's a clerical error rather than a checking error. And rather like your driving license with all these, if you've got the odd minor here and there, and it's not indicative of a lax safeguarding culture, you'd probably be okay. You start to get a number like we've got on the sheet already, and that starts to raise question marks in the inspector's head, doesn't it? That you're actually not doing this seriously, or you're not trained, or you're not bothered. And then things start to go very wrong. Again, so he's working in front of children, no prohibition from teaching check, that's lax. That should have been done before he started work. And he's also got a prohibition from management. Why? He's not head of music. There's no need to have done that at all. So I hope that helps. Give you the sort of idea of how these are genuine common errors you find in your register. And if you do yours when you go back to school, you will find some of these on there, I promise. So having discovered such anomalies, what should we do next? Well, firstly, go to your staff file to see if things have been done, but not recorded on the register. And if so, update your. That's easy to do. Look to resolve any other anomalies. For example, get that missing medical check done. It's better late than never. And a common one is delayed. If an enhanced criminal record check is required, but the DBS certificate isn't available before a person starts work in regulated activity, the head may allow a member of staff to commence work in certain circumstances. They must make sure a satisfactory checklist of the barred list has been done, so a bit like the rugby coach there. They must make sure that all the other relevant checks have been completed satisfactorily. They must make sure that the DBS application was done in advance, even though the certificate hasn't arrived yet. And they must put into place appropriate safeguards, usually supervision. And the safeguards should be determined through a risk assessment. And again, your inspector would expect to see that risk assessment in that person's file to prove you've done it. Previous additional advice that used to be in case is no longer there, but I think there are certain points of good practice and evidence of safeguard that used to be there, which I'll tell you now. Number one, avoid confirming the appointment until you've got all the checks done. If you are using things like risk assessments, review those every 2 weeks and ensure that the person knows that they are subject to those risk assessments so that they can take heed of them as well. And then put notes in either on your single central register or better still, evidence of the measures in that staff member's file. If you've got worries about an existing colleague, then life gets a bit more difficult. Casey tells us that if we have concerns about a colleague's suitability to work with children, that the school or college should carry out all relevant checks as if the person were a new member of staff. Similarly, if a person working at the school moves from a post that wasn't regulated activity to one that's going to be, then you must do the additional checks that will be required out, for example, the barred list or prohibition from teaching. And I had that in a school earlier in the year, for example. There was a caretaker who had become a PE assistant, and that register looked fascinating because the dates seemed to be so disparate. He was employed several years ago, but only had the later ones done recently when he changed jobs. Don't forget in academies and independent schools to do a management check for senior roles where there's internal promotion. And there's also a legal duty, which I will read to you. And it says, schools and colleges have a legal duty to refer to the DBS anyone who has harmed or poses a risk of harm to a child. If the individual has received a caution or conviction for a relevant offence, or there's reason to believe that the individual has committed a listed relevant offence, and the individual has been removed from working in regulated activity, or would have been removed had they not left, you must report them to the DBS. So people on your current staff who you've had to ease out or who have left and you've got suspicions and worries about need reporting if they've committed an offence. We do all this as part of our duty to keep our children safe. It's a duty inspected by Ofsted and by ISI, but it remains the responsibility of the management of the school. Governors should be asking questions to ensure that checks are done, and heads should be ensuring checks are done by appropriately informed colleagues. You can't just leave this to your most junior admin staff. A failure to check your staff and keep an up-to-date register means you'll fail the safeguarding section of your inspection. A school that can't safeguard its pupils will then fail its leadership and management. That's not good publicity. Just because someone didn't take care with the regulations or didn't audit the little spreadsheets, you need to get into the habit of validating a candidate's papers at interview and doing the right checks and ensuring those checks are properly recorded on the register and in the personnel files of your workers, your governors and some volunteers. Get a safer recruitment policy and stick to it. We're almost there. Now, I'll send out the slides for you a little later, and there are a couple of useful documents linked here as well. There's the new Keeping Children Safe document, which has some changes from 2019, so that's useful in its own right. There's also a sample safe recruitment policy, which you can adapt as you like for your own school, if that would help. So I hope this has helped you to see the importance of the task. There's a lot to it, but it's quite straightforward once you start doing it on a regular basis. If you've got any questions, you can reach me on one of the channels you can see listed here. And I would encourage you to follow me, follow David Winfield, and also the Independent Schools portal to hear about lots of brilliant events coming up in the near future. There's a whole summer of activity and with all sorts of interesting courses. So I hope that's been useful for you. And I thank you for your time and thank you for joining us. And we'll leave you there. Thank you very much indeed.